Reaching out to Muslims, Donald Trump called on Arab and Islamic leaders to join his fight against extremism. He said Muslim countries must share the burden to drive out those he calls terrorists. He stuck to the script, but was the U.S. president convincing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. Business, terrorism, governance. The Arab Islamic American Summit in Riyadh had it all. It was Donald Trump's first trip abroad as president, and Saudi Arabia pulled out all the stops with a grand royal welcome. A business deal was signed worth $350 billion, about a third of which was weapons sales. Trump and Saudi Arabia's King Salman say political relations have also been strengthened. And so now to Trump's much anticipated speech to the Arab world, a world he has been strongly critical of during his election campaign. He urged Muslim leaders to take the lead in the fight against terrorism.
Terrorism has spread all across the world, but the path to peace begins right here on this ancient soil in this sacred land. America is prepared to stand with you in pursuit of shared interests and common security. But the nations of the Middle East cannot wait for American power to crush this enemy for them. The nations of the Middle East will have to decide what kind of future they want for themselves, for their country, and frankly, for their families and for their children.
The summit was also about realigning perceptions of power in the region. Former U.S. President Barack Obama seemed to distance himself from Saudi Arabia by working with Iran as a regional leader. As a longtime critic of Iran, Trump is looking to reverse that policy.
From Lebanon to Iraq to Yemen, Iran funds arms and trains terrorists, militias, and other extremist groups that spread destruction and chaos across the region. For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. Until the Iranian regime is willing to be a partner for peace, all nations of conscience must work together to isolate Iran, deny it. Funding for terrorism cannot do it. And pray for the day when the Iranian people have the just and righteous government they so richly deserve.
We'll speak to our guests in a moment. First, let's talk to Robert Jordan. He is the former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us. What would you say Donald Trump has accomplished so far on this trip?
I think he's accomplished what he set out to do, which was to, first of all, make it clear to the world that he is not Barack Obama, that he has a stronger view of relationships, particularly with the Sunni Middle East. And I think he also wanted to make it very clear that despite some of the campaign rhetoric, he actually has respect for the religion of Islam and is trying to differentiate between those who use the religion for devious purposes and those who actually adhere to it in a moderate and respectful way.
Should people have confidence, though, in the things that he said and what he's reflecting, since, as you brought up, he said something completely different on the campaign trail?
Well, time will tell. My guess is that he will stick with the current view of things. Let's remember that he has not been a politician. He's a brand new president. He is, I think, in a learning process now, and he seems to learn best from personal encounters, personal conversations. And so I think part of this trip is really the education of Donald Trump.
So what more do you see in his administration's vision for the region?
Well, I think the speech spells out a galvanizing effort to take on the terrorists in a confrontational way. What the speech doesn't do, and I think there's more to be done here, is to address the political and social factors that can become a breeding ground for terrorism. Poor governance, lack of participation by citizenry, and corruption. And so I think this is where these countries of the Middle East also can contribute tremendously by improving their governance, eliminating corruption, as many of them are trying to do, and make it clear that there is a role for their citizens to play, and that they should have greater participation. So this is down the line. You can't pour everything into one speech, but I do think that's probably one of the next steps.
Do you think it's possible that Donald Trump and his administration will realize along the way how difficult these challenges are? Because if they were so easy to get done, somebody would have gotten them done.
Exactly. I think there would be a reality check from time to time here. I think every new president comes in with an agenda of optimism and a belief that they can cure all the world's problems. And it's obviously not the case. And I think that reality will set in with them as well.
Particularly when there's not necessarily a consensus on what terrorism is, who a terrorist is. You have to be very careful with the words that you use. If there's so much diversity of thought on something like that, how much of a challenge is it for people to be on the same page about what to do about it?
I think it's a tremendous challenge to cut through some of the self-serving notions of terrorism that some of these regimes have. So, for example, the Turks and President Erdogan view the Kurds as terrorists, and yet the American view might be somewhat different there. So I think there's going to have to be a baseline in which we recognize certain clearly terrorist activities and others that are going to be more ambiguous. We're going to have to live with ambiguity, I'm afraid, throughout the rest of history.
I think that's actually a perfect place to wrap this up. I think you summed that up just right. Mr. Ambassador Robert Jordan, thank you very much for your time. Joining me now, our guest from Riyadh, Ahmed Alibrahim, a Saudi affairs specialist. In Washington, D.C., Henri Barkey, the director of the Middle East program at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And from Tehran, Sadegh Zibakalam, professor of political science at the University of Tehran. Welcome to all of you for this discussion. I appreciate it. Ahmed, I want to start with you in Riyadh. Do you think that U.S. President Donald Trump managed to heal any doubts, any damage that may have been caused by some of his campaign rhetoric, in particular the travel ban that he tried to impose on 7 Muslim-majority countries, a ban that was only not imposed because the courts have stopped it? Do you think that he's accomplished anything to pivot on that?
Well, definitely President Trump, by landing Air Force One in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, the land of the Holy Islam, Mecca and Medina, definitely sealed that. What Trump did is not only he came to the country, he chose the right cabinet that they know the region. President Trump, when he actually addressed his historic speech, he did not just say the speech that Obama did back then in Cairo. What Trump did is he took every country in the Middle East and he started indicating what the challenge he's going through. So you see the effort that this administration has becoming to understand the region, how much they invested in order to really seal the problem in the regions and the challenges that this region is facing. Yes, definitely he has a lot of things in the agenda that he required from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the GCC country and the Islamic world. But again, this is a great and astonishing indication that America is back into the region. Saudi Arabia did not change for the past 8 years. What happened is the American administration changed back. Saudi Arabia has been always an ally and actually is consistent with the American policy, and they are going to restart the biggest relationship ever after the meeting of the founder of King Abdulaziz and President Roosevelt on top of the ship Quincy.
Henri, do you think that President Trump has successfully pivoted from what some of his campaign rhetoric and a policy that he wanted to enact, this travel ban? Do you think he has significantly pivoted from that in this outreach to the Muslim world?
Look, it's very difficult to tell on the basis of one visit and one speech whether or not the United States as a whole has pivoted. Mr. Trump actually doesn't know the region very well. He doesn't know the leaders at all. He doesn't know the issues very well at the moment. So I mean, he read a speech that made some of the points that his host wanted to hear, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. I mean, let's see what kind of policies will emerge from this. At the moment, this administration is having a terrible time at home. and is having a lot of difficulty articulating policies. And in reality, when you dissect the policy that Mr. Trump is enunciating, it really is not an engagement with the Middle East. It is a partial engagement and only a military engagement, an engagement with the leaders and not the peoples of the region. In that sense, President Obama failed, I think, because he came in and he had this grandiose speech. He wanted to show the United States as a leader, not just in terms of at the political level, at the economic and social levels, but he didn't follow through. Now, Trump is not promising any of these things. He's only promising essentially a military relationship, and that's easier, of course, to deliver. But is that enough? I mean, and time will tell.
Okay. Zadig, one thing that Donald Trump was very, very clear about, President Trump, is he has a very tough stance on Iran. How was the speech received there?
It was very unfortunate, Mr. Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and also his speech in Riyadh, because it came at a time when Iran experienced a very, very fantastic election that Iran is proud of it as an election which resembled democracy in Iran. More than 45 million people took part in that election, and you can only compare that election to a very Western democratic values. Unfortunately, President Donald Trump refused and kept blind eyes on this fantastic improvement as far as democratic values are concerned in Iran, and he praised the Saudis, which resemble only a despotic regime, a dictatorial, and a regime where in Saudi Arabia, election and choosing the president, etc., is a dream that may come about in 50 years' time, in 60 years' time. Mr. Donald Trump didn't see Palestinian. He didn't see the root causes of terrorism, which is lack of political development in many Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia. And he not only he didn't see this huge improvement on democracy in Iran, he also, as I mentioned, he didn't see Palestinian. He didn't see the root causes of terrorism and Daesh, etc. And it was just a sheer propaganda.
It sounds like you're saying that there's a lot to be desired from what he said. Ahmed, I want to come back to you and bring up a point that Henri made, that it seemed to him that Donald Trump spoke of, with the exception of Iran, obviously, spoke of engaging leaders in the world and business connections. Is that really engaging the people, and how important is it for him to actually engage people?
I think, I don't know, your esteemed guest, what event they've been watching. Saudi Arabia has not only hosted President Trump, they hosted the whole world, excluding Iran. Iran is not really want to be part of all this engagement. The doctor from Tehran, unfortunately.
No, hold on.
I do understand. I'm going to come to your question.
Okay.
I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to your question. But this phony democracy in Iran, where you have the spiritual leader has his puppets to be elected, this is not a democracy. I mean, we're in 2017. This does not fly by thing. The Palestinian cause, we know what the Palestinian cause. It's an Arab country. It's not a Persian country. So we know our backyard very well. So anyway, back to your question. Donald Trump came to Saudi Arabia not because of the armed deals or 100 billion, 200 billion, because President Obama sold more weapons to Saudi Arabia than anything that Donald Trump did. So what Donald Trump came is to coexist.
One of the first things that he touted himself was this business deal. He made a point of saying, we will get you a good deal, Saudi Arabia. So you can't say that that's not something that he wants to put out there.
No, but it's not the first thing on the deal. Listen, he came to Saudi Arabia, he's going to the Jewish Holy Land, and he's going to go to the Vatican. He's not coming to Saudi Arabia and he's going to Puerto Rico or he's going to somewhere else. He's coming to coexist the three religions. He has a message of coexisting the religion and fighting terrorism and things like Qaeda and Daesh, that they've never fired a bullet in Iran, and it's financed by Iran, and the whole world know it. So he wants to come and fight evil. And he wants to have the Islamic coalition, which is over 50 countries attended this summit, 1.5 billion Muslims were looking at their leaders in Saudi Arabia. This is message for the whole world, for the whole 1.5 billion Muslims. I'm not worried about a couple 50 million or something. They just don't want to participate. And as the King Salman said, we feel bad for the Iranian people being under that regime.
Okay,
so
Ahmed,
Saudi Arabia because they know the Sunni depth of it.
Let me bring in Henri to this conversation again. Henri, I want to ask you this, and this is something that I mentioned earlier to one of our guests. We spoke to a former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and I would be interested in your thoughts on this as well. There's a diversity of thought when it comes to what terrorism is. It means different things to different people. How much of a challenge is it to actually get a grasp on something like that if everyone isn't even on the same page about what it is?
Well, look, it really depends on who you talk to in the following sense. Look, we can all agree that killing civilians, unarmed people, putting bombs in buses or in parks or in buildings is terrorism. But there are people who actually would not agree to that. I mean, if you look at the behavior of Hamas, for instance, which has done all kinds of suicide bombings, I mean, Hamas has a great deal of support in the Palestinian community and beyond. Even though we could all agree on the basic principle that you should not attack civilians. So, I mean, I think we need to make a distinction between attacking.
And you actually make the point, and I want you to continue, but you're right. You describe it that way. Someone else would call it just the resistance, therefore the challenge in this, right?
But look, resistance, I think individuals have the right to resist. They can resist in peaceful manners, they can resist in violent ways. But if you're going to resist violently, then you do it against people who can defend themselves. Taking an aircraft, hijacking an aircraft or flying an aircraft into a building cannot be anything but terrorism. Because otherwise, then if you accept that, if you then say that flying an aircraft into a building is legitimate resistance, then any state will then come back and attack you and attack your civilians. I mean, so you're opening up a Pandora's box. And unfortunately, in the Middle East, especially because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, many people have gotten away with this very loose definition of terrorism. Right? That doesn't mean that states don't do things that are abhorrent, that states don't kill indiscriminately. And when states do that, we call those states on their activities. So, but I think until now, terrorism has had an easy pass. And I don't think this is going to change, by the way, because Mr. Trump went to Saudi Arabia and made this speech. I think there are deep differences in terms of what is a terrorist and what is not a terrorist. I mean, we see that in Syria, we see it in Iraq on a daily basis. I mean, some groups that we would call terrorists are being supported by regimes in the region, and other groups that are more moderate, let's say, that only attack, let's say, the Syrian government because they haven't been very effective, have been cast aside. So I don't think we're going to see a big change in this because of Mr. Trump.
Zadig, I want to bring you in on, Henri mentioned Syria, which I think is really very important to discuss. Now that Saudi Arabia has this new boost of support from the U.S., just verbally and also when it comes to weapons, do you think Iran will change course in Syria?
Well, Iran has always maintained that the ultimate solution for Syria is a free and fair election. Now, Iran, in theory, is prepared even to accept that if the Syrian people choose a government other than Bashar Assad, Iran is prepared. Iran, I'm repeating, Iran is prepared to accept, provided that international bodies, international organization can guarantee that the election would be free and fair, because the Islamic regime maintains that the only solution, the only possible solution ultimately in Syria must be maintained by the Syrian people.
In the meantime, Iran is supporting Bashar al-Assad. I'm asking, do you think that will waver in any way?
Yes, but you see, but in the meantime, if tomorrow, we all know that if tomorrow Bashar Assad falls from power, it would be Daesh, it would be the IS who would enter Damascus, not democratic opposition of Bashar Assad regime.
Ahmed, let me bring you into this, because I could tell by your reactions off camera you have some thoughts, but let's just to remind viewers, U.S. policy has basically been much more aligned with Bashar al-Assad, right? But where do you think?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, the doctor just told you he guaranteed a good election in Syria. That tells you how much Iran is holding Syria, and they're holding Bashar al-Assad by his neck. They are very infiltrated in the system. They are there. They are the gatekeepers for Bashar al-Assad that killed 500,000 innocent souls. And this is what Iran is all about, in erupting this country. I mean, I would like to see more universities getting money from all the money they are supporting the militia in Iraq and in Syria and Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization today, and the Houthis. And believe it or not, the Houthis has fired the first missile in the history of Islam on Mecca on behalf of Iran. So Iran is a Persian country. It's an Iran. It's a different blood race than the Arab nation. I don't understand why this all money has been dumped in a bad way. If ISIS is going to take care of Syria and Iran doesn't want ISIS to fill that vacuum in the instead of Bashar al-Assad, well, guess what? If Iran stop funding terrorism and they stop harboring Al-Qaeda members and they stop letting Iran be the pathway for terrorists to go bomb some restaurant in Turkey, I think there will be no problem and no fear of ISIS being occupying
Henri,
Syria. But Iran needs to come to the international community.
All right, Ahmed, I know. So, Henri, let me ask you this. Donald Trump spoke at length about wanting to reverse former President Obama's lifting of sanctions in Iran. He's talked a lot about that. Do you actually think that that's something that will happen?
Well, look, I think Donald Trump is going to follow a two-track policy and kind of put so much pressure on the Iranians that and essentially force the Iranians to make a choice. That is to say, he's not going to back down from the JCPOA, i.e. the nuclear agreement with Iran, because most of the countries that were part of this want this to continue. And let's face it, at the moment, a military confrontation with Iran would be exceedingly expensive, and that's not something even Trump wants. But what he will do, he's going to continue squeezing Iran as much as he can with secondary or third level sanctions, and hope that this will essentially force a change in Iran's policy. I think, look, Iranian behavior in Syria has definitely been reprehensible. I mean, this notion of elections in Syria would be acceptable to Iran is really a non-starter, in the sense that where were the Iranians when this trouble started and Bashar Assad started firing on civilians? I mean, they weren't calling for elections then. So now that Assad essentially has consolidated a little part of Syria, now they talk about elections. So I think what Trump is going to do is try to put as much pressure on Iran, not just with sanctions, but also in Syria.
Okay.
And let's face it, Syria is not going to be solved anytime soon.
All right. And that'll have to be the last word. Thank you all very much for the conversation. We appreciate it. Ahmed Alibrahim, Henri Barkey, and Sadegh Ziba Kalam. And thank you all for watching. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.